And one of the things he has to say, this is in 1882, he says, "The Venice of today is a vast museum where the little wicket that admits," actually I can read off, when I can't read off the light, I'll ask you to turn it on. Do you prefer to have the light off? Okay. Off if we can, otherwise if my eyes are taking strain, I'll let you know. On. We have a riot. Okay, well, we'll just, the lights weren't dim, unfortunately. Do you want to turn them on? No, leave. Okay, well, look, we'll play around with it. We'll do some on, some off. So he says, "The Venice of today is a vast museum where the little wicket that admits you is perpetually turning and creaking, and you march through the institution with a herd of fellow gazers. There is nothing left to discover or describe, and originality of attitude is completely impossible." He's writing this in 1882. Several years later, he is much more mellow about Venice, and in fact 1902 is also the year that he is composing The Wings of the Dove. And he has this very lyrical comment to make about the kinds of people who come to Venice, who find solace in Venice. "It is a fact that almost everyone interesting, appealing, melancholy, memorable, odd, seems at one time or another, after many days and much life, to have gravitated to Venice by a happy instinct, settling in it and treating it, cherishing it as a sort of repository of consolations," which is such a lovely phrase, "all of which today, for the conscious mind, is mixed with its air and constitutes its unwritten history." And then he moves into this lovely phrase, "the deposed, the defeated, the disenchanted, the wounded, or even only the bored, have seemed to find there something that no other place can give." So he's come to terms a little bit with the tourists. He is also very fond of characterizing Venice as a woman. And he has this to say: "The creature varies like a nervous woman, whom you know only when you know all the aspects of her beauty. She has high spirits or low, she is pale or red, grey or pink, cold or warm, fresh or wan, according to the weather or the hour. She is always interesting and almost always sad." It comes back to this idea of melancholy, which is of course going to feed into the way in which he links Millie Teal with Venice. "But she has 1,000 occasional graces and is always liable to happy accidents." There are other moments where he talks about how wonderful it is to sail around Venice in a gondola with an intelligent companion who is invariably an intelligent woman. There's this wonderful passage on how women are the best companions because they're most insightful, they're most responsive to the beauties of Venice, and how he loves to travel with them and then stop off when he wants to look at a beautiful church or a lovely painting. I mean, it sounds so idyllic. These are the days before the Vaporetto came, and you could do this. He also talks about the aging of Venice and wonders if decrepitude and the aging process is actually part of her charm, that she wouldn't be as charming if she wasn't aging. Here's another wonderful moment where he goes on about how awful the tourist season is in destroying these beauties of Venice. This is the tourist season, so really from about March, May onwards, March, April. "The barbarians are in full possession, and you tremble for what they may do. You are reminded from the moment of your arrival that Venice scarcely exists anymore as a city at all, that she exists only," and this is a very famous line, "as a battered peep show and bazaar. The peddlers and commissioners ply their trade, often a very unclean one, at the very door of the temple. There is a great deal of dishonour about St. Mark's altogether, and if Venice, as I say, has become a great bazaar, this exquisite edifice is its greatest booth." And there's another wonderful phrase that he has where he calls Venice at the tourist season the vomitorium of Boston. Some of the other things that he hates, and he would agree with Ruskin here, he actually hates restoration. He loves that old mouldering sense of the buildings. He loves the patina of age. He loves it when the colours become mellow. And he gets horrified when people come along and so-called restore the buildings and make them bright and garish. He gets very upset about that. Like Ruskin, he's also very fond of the Gothic tradition. He loves what we would now call the sort of feminine virtues of these buildings: surface, tone, detail. And he says the things that we can touch or kneel upon or lean against, what he calls a treasury of bits. He doesn't like the Palladian designs at all. He's really rude about those Renaissance designs. He also talks with great love of the precious colour pink, which he thinks is the main colour of Venice. Various shades of pink from the sky to the sea at different times of the day, and of course the buildings, the stones that they're made of. And he also, and this is relevant to the Aspen Papers, particularly loves the gardens. He loves those moments when you will sail past a wall and realize that there's growth climbing over the top of the wall, and the way in which leaves and vines will emerge from the red bricks, he thinks is just so beautiful. So gardens, very important for him. He thinks they're one of the most important aspects of Venice. Venice without them would be too much a matter of the tides and the stones. Even the little trellises of the traghetti count charmingly as reminders amid so much artifice of the woodland nature of man. Still man, even though he loves women. But anyway, so the garden is very important. And as I said, I'm not going to concentrate too much on the Aspen Papers, but I will mention it a little bit because it's a wonderful, wonderful tale about Venice. Can we have the light on just briefly? Thanks, Angus. This is so that I can see you a bit as well. How many of you have read the Aspen Papers? Okay, it really is very accessible, as those of you who've read it will know. It's not the late James, which The Wings of the Dove is. It's much earlier, James, 1888. It's a wonderful story, and it was made into a film by Martin Gable in 1947, a travesty. The film is an absolute travesty, but the story itself is marvelous, which brings me to the question of James and adaptation. These are just some of the titles that I have seen. People love trying to adapt him, although he's often seen as really, really difficult, sometimes even called impossible to adapt. But there are some examples. Very successful version of The Turn of the Screw, directed by Jack Clayton in 1961. If you know that story, a sort of horror story of this governess who may be having hallucinations or may just be very neurotic, or she may really be seeing the ghosts, and the children may really be evil. We just don't know. The ambiguity is paramount. And Jack Clayton turned out a really extraordinary film called The Innocents, with Deborah Carr playing the governess. We then get to go back in time. We get The Lost Moment, which is based on the Aspen Papers, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. One of my favorite comes just after The Lost Moments. I don't know how many of you have seen The Heiress, with Olivia de Havilland, who's just turned 101. So amazing. Olivia de Havilland playing Catherine Sloper, whose father is absolutely resolute that she will not be allowed to marry the man played by Morris Townsend, played by Montgomery Clift, because her father sees that he's a fortune hunter. So in that quite early novel already, James is very, very interested in the relationship between love and money and fortune seekers who will destroy the beloved object, which is, of course, what we find in Wings of the Dove. It's a magnificent film. Again, my hero, Martin Scorsese, thinks the sun shines out of it. It is available online. So when you've got a moment, do watch it. Daisy Miller came out in 1974 with Peter Bogdanovich directing Sybil Shepherd, who was his lover at the time. Bad mistake. He shouldn't have done that. It's completely forgettable. I did watch it years ago, but it's very flat. But then in 1996, Jane Campion made this really interesting version of The Portrait of a Lady with Nicole Kidman and John Malkovich and Barbara Hershey in the lead roles. And that is interesting to compare with The Wings of a Dove. Firstly, it's long. It's about 135 minutes long, and it needs to be. It's a very complex novel, and she gives it breathing space. She gives it time. She allows the actors to convey all the multiple senses of consciousness, the nuances of their emotions. There's a very unfortunate prologue that she has, but for the rest of it, it's extremely well done. And she doesn't try for genre. She tries to engage with the richness of the text. We then get Ian Softley's The Wings of the Dove in 1997. Now, who of you managed to see it when Terrell screened it? Or you've seen it. I'm interested to know what your response to it was. Stunning. Okay, why was it stunning?
Acting, everything, Venice itself.
Okay. Have you read the novel? Okay. It's such an interesting film because I loved it. When I first saw it, I was over the moon about it, and then of course I read the novel, and I have such a difficult time now. The further I remove myself from the novel, the more I enjoy the film. And I think one of the reasons is because they gave us a 107-minute film. That's not very long for this big, heavy, complex novel. And they also decided to go with a particular genre to make it move much more quickly. So we'll talk about that in a moment. And then James Ivory, very famous for the Merchant Ivory films, directed another of the late novels, The Golden Bowl. So James is a contested figure when it comes to adaptation, and it would be quite interesting, I think, if you watch some of those and see what you think of them. As you can see from the Aspen Papers, it's often linked to The Turn of the Screw. It's also seen as a very suspenseful story, although it's not a potentially horror story in the way that The Turn of the Screw is. It was based or inspired by a story that Henry James heard about Claire Claremont, who was this very desirable but tempestuous woman who was apparently the lover of both Percy Bysshe Shelley and Lord Byron. And they both wrote letters to her. She was also the stepsister of Mary Shelley. So there was this strange ménage à trois that was going on that people have had a lot of fun trying to fathom. But apparently both these men wrote love letters to her, and an editor found out that she was still alive, living in Florence. She was about 80 years old. She was living with her 50-year-old niece. And this editor, this art critic, was desperate to get hold of the letters. He arrived in Florence and she died. So then he tried to persuade the niece to let him have the letters. And she said, well, I'll let you have the letters if you marry me. So the story goes that he's still running. James is very interested in that story, and in fact that's the basis of the Aspen Papers. We have a nameless narrator who is passionate about a poet, a 19th century poet called Jeffrey Aspen, and he finds out that Juliana Boudreau, who was his great, beautiful, magnificent lover, is still alive, although she's very, very, very old, and she's living in Venice with her niece. Miss Tina, she's first called Miss Tita, and then in another version, Miss Tina. In my version, she's Miss Tita. And so this nameless narrator decides to go and weasel his way into the palazzo where she lives, to suck up to her and the niece, and to try and get hold of the letters. But what is so wonderful about the story is that he calls the narrator guilty of literary concupiscence, which I think is wonderful. And the narrator is awful. His whole attitude towards these women is predicated on a very patronizing arrogance. He utterly fails to understand the two women. He thinks he can't put one over on them. And he completely underestimates both of them. He's also very rude about the younger woman. But there are these wonderful moments in the story moments of dialogue which are thrust and parry, as we can see that the women are getting the better of him all the time, but he doesn't see it. At the end, this is a description which is, I think, a really telling description of Juliana when he first meets her. He's introduced into the parlor, a fine old painted ceiling, and a strange figure sitting alone at one of the windows. He then realizes he's been left alone because the niece has left them in the room, and he talks about this terrible relic that is the aunt. She's very, very ancient. She was too strange, too literally resurgent. Then came a check with a perception that we, as first-person narration, with the perception that we were not really face-to-face, inasmuch as she had over her eyes a horrible green shade, which for her served almost as a mask. I believed for an instant that she had put it on expressly, so that from underneath it she might scrutinize me without being scrutinized herself. Well, of course she has. And so the story progresses. It becomes very suspenseful. Is he going to find his way to the letters? Is he going to find the letters? Is he going to be able to wrest them from Juliana? And there's this marvelous moment when he finds he's got access to her own room and there's no one there. And he starts ferreting around in this room looking for the letters. And it's really, really nasty. I mean, he's just awful. And then we have the climax. I looked over my shoulder. It was a chance, an instinct, for I had not heard anything. I almost let my luminary drop, and certainly I stepped back, straightening myself up at what I saw. Miss Baudreau stood there in her nightdress, in the doorway of her room, watching me. Her hands were raised. She had lifted the everlasting curtain that covered half her face. And for the first, the last, the only time I beheld her extraordinary eyes. They glared at me. They made me horribly ashamed. I never shall forget her strange little bent, white, tottering figure with its lifted head, her attitude, her expression. Neither shall I forget the tone in which, as I turned, looking at her, she hissed out passionately, furiously, "Ah, you publishing scoundrel!" Which is so great. And of course, so this is a wonderful moment because people have asked, well, you know, okay, James is fascinated by the story, but this moment is also about how obsessive he was about keeping his own privacy. He didn't want people writing biographies of him. He didn't want people ferreting around in his private life. And there's a suggestion, Constance Fenimore Wilson was a very dear friend of his, and they'd exchanged a whole series of very confidential letters, and then she died very suddenly, quite possibly by suicide. And he was very anxious to get to her villa in Venice and with one of her relatives go through all her correspondence so that he could retrieve anything that she might not have destroyed of his. So there's a kind of autobiographical quality there. It's a marvelous story, so I do recommend you read it. I mean, what happens is that this really kills Juliana. She doesn't recover, and then he's left with Miss Tita, who does know where the letters are. And Miss Tita says to him, effectively, "I will give you access to the letters if you marry me." And he has a hernia, and he goes off on a gondola for a while, and then he comes back and he thinks, no, he can do this, he can do this. And she says, but I've done what I needed to do. I have burnt them. So cool. And of course, you know, there's nothing you can do about it. They've gone. Now, it's a marvelous story, but what we have with the Hollywood version, 1947, you can see exactly what we have. It's a completely different take. It's completely rewritten. As critics have pointed out, it comes in the wake, 1947, of a burgeoning of Gothic noir films, Wuthering Heights, Rebecca. So the story is completely rewritten, and we have Robert Cummings, who's really kind of sweet and faceless, and one critic says he was always made to be a place marker. You know, he doesn't bring anything to the role. But he comes along, and in fact he does get hold of the letters, and we have this whole other story that's developed around Susan Hayward, the very beautiful Susan Hayward, playing Miss Tina, who is the niece of Juliana, played by an unrecognizable Agnes Moorehead. There was much, we can have the lights off again, Angus. There was much more discussion about the hours that Agnes Moorehead had to spend under makeup or being made up to look 105 than anything else. I mean, she's not given much room to perform with that. And the story in the film goes that Tina is schizophrenic. Half the time she is Juliana's daughter, a niece rather. The rest of the time she fantasizes that she is in fact Juliana. She plays the piano beautifully, and she dreams of what he's called Frederick Ashton in the film, of him coming back. She mistakes Robert Cummings for Frederick Ashton. To cut a very long story short, what happens at the end is that there's a crisis moment when Tina wakes up out of her hallucinations and she realizes her love for the Robert Cummings figure. And Juliana falls apart. She breaks down, and she collapses. She knocks over a candle. The candle sets the curtains alight, and we have a fantastic fire which burns down the whole villa, just like the end of Rebecca. So, I mean, this has got nothing to do with James. And it's an instance, as one critic says, the film is... this is what he describes it as. It's a film noir psychological thriller with elements of horror. So it's a kind of generic mix, but it's very orientated towards a specific genre rather than what I see as a fundamentally comic narrative that James gives us. So that's my comments, because I did say in the course outline we talk about that. So if you have a chance to read it, the film is available on YouTube. It's very easy to watch. It's a great deal of fun in itself. Susan Hayward turns in a very nice performance, and she's very pretty, my mother's favourite actress. But let's move on to The Wings of the Dove, and this is very different James. This is the first of what we know as the late James. Wings of the Dove, The Ambassadors and the Golden Bowl, very complex, long novels which are heavy reads. Interestingly, there's a basic plot that Ian Softly and Hussein Amini were able to lift out of it, which is about two quite impecunious lovers who find a way to make themselves wealthy, to be able to marry freely, if they can be very, very charming to the rich heiress, Millie Teal. Millie is dying. If they can make her love, especially the man, the hope is that she will leave him a great deal of her money, and then Merton Densher, as he's called, and Kate Croy will be able to marry. So it's a terrible story. It's a potentially very violent story. It has shades of The Postman Always Rings Twice. It's that kind of narrative again, where two lovers conspire and intrigue to kill a third party so that they can be rich. But of course, James brings to it immense subtlety and richness and nuance, a great deal of ambiguity, what one critic calls different registers of consciousness, as the story is seen from different perspectives all the time. We keep shifting perspective, we keep shifting point of view, so we can't simply settle on some sort of melodramatic structure of who's good and who's bad. And I thought the covers were quite interesting because they suggest the different ways in which Millie has been imagined, the different ways in which Venice has been imagined as central to the text. One of the key inspirational forces for Henry James was the death of his beloved cousin Minnie Temple, who was only 24 when she died. She died of tuberculosis. She was a very interesting young woman, a bit of a rebel, a real free spirit, who at the age of 16 decided to shave her head. So that's at 16, Minnie deciding this is what she wants, and James being horrified. Could no one wrest the shears from her vandal hand, he says. But there's another photograph of her taken later, and quite a haunting one for him. It was haunting. Lyndall Gordon writes, James secreted and brooded over this photograph of Minnie, taken in September 1869, only 6 months before her death. And he says, I prize the ghostly image all the more for the lapse of time. He writes this 44 years later, and also in 1914, he writes a memoir about her, which is very beautiful and very moving to read. And he clearly saw her as this young person with immense possibilities, with a huge zest for living, with enormous generosity of spirit, someone who was so interested in people around her, who was interested in seeing them become the best they possibly could, who kicked against the pricks of convention all the time. So seeing her is really the perfect image of what he would like to call the American girl, who was the, as one critic puts it, the heiress of all the ages, because she comes with this heritage of independence and freedom, a kind of freedom that American girls were seen to have at the time, rather more than European girls. And at the end of his memoir, he writes, death at the last was dreadful to her. She would have given anything to live. And the image of this, which was long to remain with me, appeared so of the essence of tragedy that I was in the far-off after-time to seek to lay the ghost by wrapping it, a particular occasion aiding, in the beauty and dignity of art. And that's what The Wings of the Dove is. It's his homage to Minnie. It's his attempt to create something that is dignified in his own artistic world. Actually, I wanted to say a little bit. Did I want to say any more about her? I guess I could. I want to say a little bit more about the novel before I move on to the film. That next, we can have the night one, yeah, because I'm going to. So I thought I'd say a little bit about the novel because the film is very enjoyable. It's a rip-roaring treat. It's a bodice ripper. It's got Helena Bonham Carter in it, and Alison Elliott turns in a lovely performance. It's visually very stunning. But there are some very interesting things about what James does in the novel that I thought I could mention before we move on to the film. One of the key things in the novel is that we start off with a context for Kate. It's very important for us to understand that Kate is very poor. She comes from a very beleaguered family. Her father is living a dreadful life, and we don't know why. We never know what caused his downfall. We never know what caused his ostracization by society. In the film, we're told that he's an opium addict, but that isn't anywhere in the book, and you can read whatever you like into why Leonard Croy has collapsed in this way. And he's a terrible, terrible drain on Kate. Her mother has died, her married sister is living in very impecunious circumstances, and also puts enormous pressure on Kate because Kate has been taken up by her Aunt Maud. Aunt Maud has recognized potential in Kate. She wants to make Kate a rich woman. She wants to marry her off richly. And the rest of Kate's family see this as an opportunity for them to escape their poverty. And there's a wonderful moment when she's with her sister, Mrs. Condrip, in this rather shabby little house in Chelsea. And she says she existed in that view wholly for the small house in Chelsea, which is as the younger sister. That's how she exists. The moral of which, moreover, of course, was that the more you gave yourself, the less of you was left. There were always people to snatch at you, and it would never occur to them they were eating you up. They did that without tasting, which I think a lot of us know about. Teachers know about it. But it's a very interesting moment. So Kate is in prison. She's trapped. She's got so many pressures on her to perform the role that Aunt Maud wants her to perform so that she can help out the rest of her family. Aunt Maud is quite terrifying in the novel. She's a great manager of Kate, and I don't have time to read the passages, but there's some marvellous moments. There's a reception that Aunt Maud gives, and she invites Merton Densher, and a number of other people. And Kate is turned into something very beautiful with jewels and makeup and dress. Everything is perfect. But Densher's point of view, he suddenly feels ill, because as he watches, he sees that Kate is doing everything that her aunt tells her to do. She's dressing as her aunt tells her to do. She's moving as her aunt tells her to do. She's behaving. She is a bird in a gilded cage, basically. And what he sees is this performer who is quite robotic at this point, going through the motions that are expected of her. So again, the terrible entrapment of Kate is very powerfully felt. We don't really get that in the film, and we'll look at an image in a moment of how different that relationship between Maud and Kate is presented in the film. We also have the complexity of Millie that is developed through descriptions of her movements of consciousness, which are the product of language. So, of course, it's always difficult for film to know how to transpose the qualities of the language. But there are also dramatizations of dialogue and encounter, which are very, very interesting, and also mise en scène, the setting where Millie finds herself. There's a marvelous scene where she goes up into the Alps. She and Susan, her companion, are up in the Alps, and Millie goes out to a far ledge, and she's sitting there very precariously on the edge. And Susan sees her, decides that Millie is in her own world. She's experiencing some kind of transcendence, some kind of sublimity, and Susan mustn't interrupt her. She must leave Millie to have this experience. And it's a wonderful description, almost as if Millie is a kind of, well, in fact, even the words are used. She's surveying all her kingdoms and deciding which she should choose, or maybe she wants all of them, which is very similar to Christ's temptation. You know, he's presented with all the kingdoms of the earth. But in the case of Millie, it's about the fact that she knows that she's very, very ill, and she has to make choices. What is she going to take? Because like Minnie Temple, she wants everything. She wants all of life, and she has to make choices. But in that particular moment, she's free, and she's got this glorious space in front of her. We get a very different take on that in the film. It's when she climbs up the stairs to the top of St. Marco, and she kind of has a breath of fresh air, which is not quite the same thing. And then the last thing, which we will move on to in a moment, is her confrontation with the painting. So let's look then. These are the directors of the film. Well, Ian Softly directed. We don't hear much of him anymore. He sort of came and went. So this is another problem. You know, I would love James Ivory to have directed the film, or Martin Scorsese. And Hossein Amini, he wrote the screenplay, but there's a critic who points out where they went afterwards. Hossein Amini particularly was notable for, after finishing the film, Softly made the dreadful K-Pax with Kevin Spacey and then disappeared from Hollywood's radar. Amini, on the other hand, went on to adapt Elmore Leonard's Kill Shot, Patricia Highsmith's The Two Faces of January, and John le Carré's Our Kind of Traitor, a diet of treachery, extortion, and murder that would make lesser men blanch. So this is quite interesting because it points out what these filmmakers are interested in, where their passions lie, and what they are going to bring when they read The Wings of the Dove. And in fact, Hossein Amini went on record and saying, well, what I saw there was film noir. I was going to make Kate the sort of femme fatale of film noir, which of course he does, but it does then diminish all sorts of other aspects of her. So this is the image that we have in the film. We don't have the scene of Densher feeling ill as he watches Kate on display, promenading around the room under the eagle eye of Aunt Maud. We have this scene where Aunt Maud is simply making her up, and perhaps cinematically it works well. We can see that Aunt Maud has control of her, but it's the camera's point of view, it's not Densher's. So it loses that dynamism where a character who's in love with Kate is feeling ill to see how trapped she is. And because he feels that sickness, he's going to be more in thrall to Kate's plan that he should seduce Millie so that he and Kate can get married with her money. So that link between Kate and Densher is lost in this kind of depiction. The other important difference between the films is at the heart of, between the film and the novel, at the heart of the novel is one of the most powerful scenes where Millie goes to Matcham, which is the manor house owned by Lord Mark, whom you might remember from the film. And Lord Mark says to her, I've got your look-alike, you have to come with me. And he takes her way into the heart of the home. It's very important that the painting is in the heart of the home. And he shows her this very famous painting by Bronzino. And he says, that is you, that's your double. And so we get to understand what Millie looks like. This very moving, do you want to turn the light off? Thanks. This very moving, strange, almost impenetrable painting of Lucrezia Panchatiki. I looked it up. Panchatiki, I think how you pronounce it. But what is strange about it is that she's very bold, she's very brilliant. Of course, she's got the red hair that Millie has. She's gorgeously garbed, but she is framed by darkness. And Millie stands in front of the painting and she recognizes its beauty and its mystery, but she starts crying. Tears just start streaming down her face. And she says, yes, it is very beautiful, but what she understands, she doesn't say it, but she understands in terms of James's prose, that she is dead, dead, dead. So this is a confrontation with her own mortality, and that is the power of the moment. They go on to talk about how like she is, her hands are so similar to Millie's, and Millie says she's got very big hands, but mine are bigger. And I thought, yes, she does have very big hands. But it's a wonderful moment. So the Bronzino often forms the frontispiece for editions. The Norton edition that I have here uses the Bronzino as the front cover, because it is such a central moment in the story, and it's a moment of recognition for Millie. It's a moment of immense pathos, and it's very beautifully done. What does the movie give us? Okay, one of the things the movie does is to move us forward from 1902 to 1910, which gives us gives the filmmakers all sorts of freedoms, and this is what Tom Shon says. It's quite a fun quotation. Armenian Softly's first significant change is to move the action forward a few years from 1902 to 1910, which is why we can see Klimt Danai, a very famous painting. It was painted in 1908. From late Victorian to late Edwardian England, with modernity looming, Merton now talks of workers' rights, women smoke at parties, where an air of oriental licentiousness prevails, and the painting at which Millie gazes in the National Gallery, very public space, not the kind of private space of Matcham in the novel, is now not a Bronzino, but Gustav Klimt's 1908 semi-nude Danai. The connection there, of course, is that she's got red hair. But interestingly, another critic has pointed out how like her posture is to that of Helena Bonham Carter's Kate, right at the end of the film, when she curls up naked on the bed in Merton's room. And the kicker, says Tom Shon, the critic, Aunt Maud is played by Charlotte Rampling, that Softly should cast as his meddlesome, overtraised dowager, the Britannia of the marketplace, the onyx-eyed star of The Night Porter. I don't know if any of you have seen The Night Porter. Tells you all we need to know about his intentions. His film feels spongy with temptation. In the back rooms of bookshops, men peruse pornography, and at parties, innuendos flow. I think this is a very funny sequence. Yes, we do have Kate using the opportunity to introduce Merton Millie to each other in front of a very lubricious, tempting kind of painting. She leaves them alone together there. She's clearly plotting. But they seem so nonplussed. What are they supposed to say about this painting? So it's a very, very curious moment, but it's clearly also a sign of what Softly and Armenia are doing. They're saying, oh, we're not interested in Bronzino. We are going to do something much more sensational and much more erotic with this couple. And of course that leads to the way in which sex is treated in the film. Now the book is really very sexy for James. I mean, it's astonishing. There's such eroticism. Merton's passion for Kate is a wonderful moment where he says to her, do you love me? Love me? Love me? And she kisses him. She gives him a big embrace. And because it's James, it's like those lovely old classic Hollywood movies. You know, the less you saw, the more exciting it was. I mean, you needed Clark Gable and Scarlett and what's her name, Vivian Leigh on the bridge. The kiss on the bridge, that's the best love scene ever in Gone with the Wind. But here it's much, much more explicit. But interestingly, they don't use the moments in the book where there is, in fact, a sexual engagement. Because what Merton asks Kate to do in Venice is to come to him, to convince him that she is completely committed to him, and then he will follow through on her scheme to seduce Millie. And she does. James, of course, doesn't describe it to us, but she goes to him. And we have this very evocative section where we read she had come to him and how it transformed him, how it made his room seem so alive, because she, Kate, is also full of a zest for life, and she had brought that life into his room in Venice. Now, I would have thought they could have used that. Well, it's there in the book, you know, give us that moment. But they don't do that. They give us the clutching and clawing of the elevator scene. And then they give us a lot of, I think, sexual ambiguity, this kind of threesome that we see in the poster. We have a number of images, for example, this one here, of which is, again, not in the novel, of Kate leaving her room. She's been molested by Lord Mark, and she chases him out, and she finds her way into Millie's bed. And it's very, very interesting. There's enormous tenderness, physical tenderness between them. The scene with the gondola, which we'll watch in a moment, is also about that crossing gender boundaries. We do have some very conventional scenes, love in the rain, although given that we don't have any rain, it's really rather wonderful. And then, of course, the final scene, which is the scene that caused a lot of talk at the time, where she curls up naked on the bed, and then they do make love, and it's very, very tragic. I think Tom Schon's analysis is quite right. It's not a joyous love-making. Helena Bonham Carter's performance is magnificent there. She looks tortured and pained and so thin and so fragile. And I think this picture at the bottom suggests that it's an agonizing moment. It's not a moment of complete erotic delight. So there are pros and cons, and I think what you find with a lot of critics is that they either find the film a complete travesty of the book and wish that the film had been close to the book, or they say, okay, let's put the book aside. I've suggested some ways in which the film has ignored the book. But it's possible to say, let's put the book aside and just look at what the film is doing in its own terms. And when you do that in detail, it's actually very rich, it's very complex. And there are two articles. Well, there's one booklet by Robin Wood that's been written on it. It's a minute analysis of the film, and he also knows the novel very well. And he says that this film is doing very interesting things with the novel. It's not just finding visual equivalence. It's assuming that you are going to read the complexity of that filmic text in interesting ways. And then a special essay was commissioned for the Norton that does the same thing, minute analysis of every single detail in the film. And maybe what I should do is just show one of those clips before I talk a little bit about the Barbara. Here we go. So this is where they arrive in Venice.
sure you'll find everything in order.
Oh, wait, Eugenio. Let's eat in the dark. Is this all yours? It's ours. Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for coming. If you ever get bored, you can invite anyone you want. Why should I get bored? If you do. Who would you like me to invite? Whoever you like. Shall I ask Merton? I already have. He said no. Do you want me to ask him? Only if you want to. Only if you want to. He's your friend. I hardly know him. All right, then. We won't ask him.
Going to come.
No, really?
It just took a little time to scrape the money together. This place was recommended by a friend.
Well, I thought he was a friend when I arrived here.
Well, here it is. Buongiorno. Note the splendid stucco work, the elegant stone motifs. This stupendous building is a classic example of early Venetian baroque and was used as a model for many of the great European palaces. If you'd like to follow me in an orderly line. Buongiorno. My roommate Giuseppe. This way, ladies. Here we have the legendary baths of the Palazzo Dencia.
Oh, surely this was modelled after the great Byzantine steam house in Constantinople.
Yes, but many would argue that that miraculous monument pales against the splendour of this later masterpiece.
How much are you paying for this, Merton?
Three.
Due gondole.
Say two boats.
Due gondole.
But there's plenty of room. We can all get on. Siamo tre insieme.
Due
There's no
gondole
point trying to
perché si
speak
fa
Italian, Merton.
due.
I'll take this one, and you and Millie take the other one.
Una serenità solamente veneziana. Signorina, i suoi occhi sono brillanti come la luna. E il colore della sua pelle è uguale a quello della luna. Lei è stupenda.
Diego's flirting with me. What's your Italian like, Millie? I can't see him in the dark. How's Merton? Merton, say something.
You're drunk, aren't you?
That's not such a bad idea. Millie, tell him I promised to be quiet. She promises to be quiet.
Tell her it's too late.
It's too late. Why? Millie. Millie. Closer. Come closer.
So it's a very, again, sort of setting up that notion of a quite erotic triangle. It's a scene that obviously doesn't happen anywhere in the book, and it's working at quite interesting levels, especially in the way in which Venice is conceived as a space of reflections. It reminds me a lot of the opening of Othello that we watched in the first, the way in which the buildings seem to become quite fluid. You're not seeing them as sturdy. They're part of these reflections that shift all the time, which of course is very appropriate for the story that we're going to have, where nothing is as it seems, where there's so much intrigue, where there's so much shifting of identity, so many masks being worn. I just wanted to mention that the Palazzo Barbaro, which is where we see them, is very important in James's life, and the filmmakers quite deliberately chose to film there. They didn't damage anything, John Barron tells us, because Henry James, used to be a very frequent guest at the Palazzo and really loved it. It was owned by a very rich Bostonians, Daniel Curtis and his wife Ariana, and they were wonderful hosts, especially to American visitors, but to visitors from all over. British, the Brownings used to stay there, it was renovated by them, so it was turned into this absolute masterpiece. And James had some of his happiest times there. There's the most beautiful moment in the novel, right at the beginning, where we don't have this kind of introduction to it, where they're all there and fooling around and having sexy little conversations about Merton Densher. It's a moment where Millie wants to be alone, and it's a very, very moving description of how she finds herself in this moment of solitude, and she can just walk through the space and come to terms with the possibilities that are still left to her. It's a little bit like the Bronzino, where she's taken into the heart of the house, and she has a silent moment where she can engage with the painting. So these moments of silence are very beautiful, but they're being dramatized by James. It's not all happening in her head. Millie is doing something, and the sort of thing that I would love to see dramatized in the film, but we don't get that because it's only 107 minutes long. Here's Henry James saying, if you've had the good fortune to enjoy the hospitality of an old Venetian home and to lead your life a little in the painted chambers that still echo with one of the historic names, you have entered by the shortest step into the inner spirit of the place. As you live in it day after day, its beauty and its interests sink more deeply into your spirit. It has its moods and its hours and its mystic voices and its shifting expressions, which is really a description of Millie it's called the Palazzo Leporelli in the novel. If in the absence of its masters you have happened to have it for yourself for 24 hours, you will never forget the charm of its haunted stillness, late on the summer afternoon, for instance, when the call of playing children comes in behind from the campo, nor the way the old ghosts seem to pass on tiptoe on the marble floors. There's a lovely evocation, and again, it's a lovely gloss on that moment for Millie, because she is being haunted. The past is descending on her because her future is being cut off by her frailty, by the fact that death is confronting her. But in that moment, she has this wonderful piece. Very, very famous painting of the interior of the Palazzo Barbaro by John Singer Sargent, who knew the family. Ariana didn't like it because she said he made her look too fat. but she was overridden, fortunately, so we still have the painting, and we can see how gorgeous it looked. That's as it looks today. It's famous for its big black gondola, and it is very, very luxurious. The other reference that we don't really get a sense of in the novel is when Millie does decide to entertain, and for the only time in the novel she wears white instead of black. And again, it's a very, very beautiful scene where she is in a kind of mini temple mode, where she is giving and she's generous and she's this presiding spirit full of a sort of quiet delight in life and a delight in the people around her. And it's an especially important moment. It's described by James as almost like a Veronese painting, and the editor suggests that he's clearly referencing this very famous the wedding feast at Cana. But it's also very important for the moment when the idea of Millie as a dove with wings that she spreads out in protection of everyone is highlighted in a conversation between Kate and Merton. Kate actually calls her a dove, and she looks at Millie walking around in her lovely white gown with pearls. She's got the most amazing pearls, which are not only a sign of her enormous wealth, but they are also, of course, we know, signs of purity. Queen Elizabeth I used to wear them, although she shouldn't have because she wasn't virginal. But anyway, but pearls have that reference that they are pure, they are virginal. So Millie becomes what Kate calls the bejeweled dove. Dove, she says, are not usually bejeweled, but she is a bejeweled dove. And then they have this conversation about how she's spreading her wings over them. It's a very, very moving moment. And again, it's dramatized, it's dialogue. So it's curious to me that something that could have worked so well filmically was not included. Nevertheless, these are just my comments, and you're entitled to ignore them. So one of the things that we come back to, and this is just to close off, is the question of genre in adapting James, or in fact in adapting any novels. Of the adaptations we've looked at, which are the films that decide that they're going to go for genre because it's the easy way out? I think The Death in Venice absolutely refuses that. In fact, I don't think Visconti goes for genre in that sense at all. In Daphne du Maurier, she's already writing in the genre of horror, so it makes it easier for the director. So the question of genre, we know that genres have rules, they have codes, they give us what we expect. We have westerns, we have noir, we have romantic comedies, whatever. Do genres always have to imply a simplification or reduction? The fact that so many of you did enjoy The Wings of the Dove suggests that even if Amini wanted to turn Henry James into film noir, the film is successful. It may leave out a lot, it may not engage with the novel in ways that I would have liked it to, but, or that, say, Jane Campion engages with Portrait of a Lady, but it works on its own terms, so maybe it's not a simplification. Of course, marketability is absolutely crucial. These guys have to sell their films. They have to have bums on seats, although these days not even bums on seats, is it? Netflix and all that kind of stuff. But you have to sell the product. It's a hugely expensive making a film as opposed to writing a novel. And in terms of adaptation studies, there have been so many comments made about the value of revisioning the source text, that you can give people new insights into the source text because of the changes that you've made, the different kinds of ideas that you've brought to that source text. And of course, we also have the issue of different versions. So the example I gave earlier of The Turn of the Screw, yes, it was made into a magnificent film in 1961, but there are so many versions of The Turn of the Screw, especially television versions. The Heiress, Washington Square, was remade as Washington Square with a completely different take on the novel by Agnieszka Holland many, many years ago. In fact, The Aspen Papers is going to be remade. It's in the process of being remade, and I think it's going to be really interesting because it's being directed by James Ivory, not directed by him, produced by him, so he's always interested in it being a bit more faithful to the source material. But the casting is so fascinating. They're having that awful, what's his name, Rhys Jones? Yes. Jonathan Rhys-Meyers. I can't even remember his name. Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, but he's going to be great in the role of the narrator. Because he is so slimy and oily, and he's going to wangle his way in there. And they've got Vanessa Redgrave playing Juliana Baudreau. So, I mean, they cannot put her in a mask where you can't recognize her. She's too good an actress. One senses they're going to give her a real part to play. And interestingly, her young daughter, Jolie Richardson, is going to play Miss Tina. So that's going to be interesting. The casting already tells us that they're going to do something very different from what Susan Hayward and Agnes Moorehead were given. So this thing of new versions is also an interesting aspect of adaptation, to see how the new versions enter into a dialogue with earlier versions. Context of production: when is the film being made? When was the novel written? What are the social and political and cultural and ideological contexts that go into producing those different texts? And I come back to something I've mentioned before. Should we just watch the film on its own terms and not worry about the source material? Or watch the film first and then go and read the book if we want to, so that we don't let the book get in the way? It's very difficult if you do know the book, and it does get in the way of the film. But one of the most popular ways of engaging with this is to see the film and the source material in dialogue with each other. They're having a conversation. So it's not that one is right and one is wrong. There are strengths and weaknesses and interesting new insights, and there's an interesting play of conversation between them. So that's one way of thinking about all the stuff that I've been talking about. And thank you very much for coming.